7:55 in the morning, December 7th, 1941. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers swarm the skies over Oahu. In 2 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy destroys or damages 8 massive battleships. 2,400 Americans die in the fire and oil. The Pacific Fleet is crippled. In Tokyo, the High Command celebrates. Champagne flows in the war rooms. The generals believe they have neutralized the American threat. They have bought themselves months of freedom in the Pacific. To them, the war is now winnable, but the victory is hollow. 3 American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor that day. They were at sea performing maneuvers. They remained untouched. More importantly, the sleeping giant of American industry began to stir. In Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle, the lights in the factories stayed on. Assembly lines began to move 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was an industrial mobilization never before seen in human history. Women, immigrants, and retirees flooded the workshops. Within 4 years, these factories would build more aircraft than Japan had produced in its entire existence. Japan's military elite believed they won the opening move. In reality, they had triggered a sequence they could not stop. They had no idea what was coming. Was Japan's victory a masterstroke? At first glance, yes, but in reality, it was a strategic suicide. Could Japan have actually won the Pacific War? Or did the first bomb dropped on Pearl Harbor seal the fate of the empire? Consider your answer now. By the end of this investigation, the data might change your mind. To understand the strike on Pearl Harbor, look past the smoke. Ignore the tactical maps. The real story lies in the economics of power. The footage from the era is clear. Huge steel mills glow red. Riveters work at a frantic pace. This was not just a battle of ships. It was a battle of resources. Events accelerated. There was no turning back. To understand why Japan attacked, you must first understand the truth about their desperation. 1941. Japan had been bogged down in the Chinese interior for 4 full years. The conflict was a massive meat grinder. Casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. There was no clear path to victory. Worst of all, the empire was running dry. 80% of Japan's oil came from foreign imports. Most of those shipments arrived from the United States. In July 1941, the situation shifted. Japan occupied French Indochina. President Franklin Roosevelt responded immediately. He froze all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch government in exile followed his lead. The result was a total oil embargo. Documents from the time show the math was brutal. Japan's military reserves would last 18 months at most. After that, the Imperial Japanese Navy would stop moving. Ships would sit immobilized in port. The fleet would become scrap metal. The choice was binary. One option, withdraw from China. This meant negotiating with Washington and accepting total humiliation. The military government would collapse under the weight of such a failure. The second option, go all in. Japan planned to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. This would secure the fuel needed to keep the war machine running. It was a massive gamble. But there was a major tactical problem. At first glance, a simple invasion, but in reality, a strategic trap. If Japan struck south, the United States would intervene. American forces in the Philippines were positioned directly across Japan's vital supply lines. Meanwhile, the U.S. Pacific Fleet waited at Pearl Harbor. Those warships could strike Japanese convoys at any moment. The footage from the era shows the scale of the Japanese fleet. Thousands of sailors prepared for a move. Command realized they could not secure the southern resources without neutralizing American power first. Events accelerated. Diplomacy failed. The sound of the aircraft engines began to fill the air. Japan decided to strike first. There was no turning back. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, a man who understood his enemy. He had studied at Harvard University. He had walked the streets of Washington as a naval attaché. He knew the scale of American industry firsthand. Yamamoto was no fanatic. He was a realist. In 1940, he spoke privately with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. His warning was blunt. If ordered to fight, he could dominate the Pacific for 6 months. After that, he had zero confidence. He knew the war would become a meat grinder. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Yamamoto looked at the data and saw a death sentence for Japan. The United States had double the population. Its economy was 5 to 7 times larger than the Japanese Empire. Then there was the steel. American mills produced 13 times more steel than every Japanese factory combined. Smoke from Pittsburgh was a physical threat to Tokyo. Every ship Japan built, America could build 10. Japanese planners ignored the math. They looked for a shortcut. They believed in a window of opportunity. The strategy was simple. Strike the United States Pacific Fleet with such force that it would remain paralyzed for 6 to 12 months. Use that time to move fast, seize the Dutch East Indies for oil, capture Malaya for rubber, occupy the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam, build a massive defensive ring across the ocean. The trap was set. When the Americans eventually moved to counterattack, they would find a wall of steel. They would face fortified island bastions. Their supply lines would stretch thousands of miles. They would meet a veteran Japanese Navy waiting in the deep water. The planners expected American blood to flow in the thousands. They gambled on a single outcome: exhaustion. This was never a plan to invade California or occupy Washington. It was a strategy of attrition. The goal was to make the cost of victory too high for the American public to stomach. They believed war-weary civilians would demand a settlement. Japan would keep its new territories. The war would end with a signed treaty. It was a gamble built on one specific belief. The Japanese High Command assumed Americans were soft. They believed the United States lacked the stomach for a long, brutal conflict. It was a calculation based on pride rather than intelligence. The assumption was a fatal error. December 7th, 1941, 6:20 in the morning Hawaiian time. 183 Japanese aircraft launch from the decks of 6 aircraft carriers. The fleet sits 230 miles north of Oahu. Engines roar, propellers spin. The first wave heads south, 7:48 a.m. The attack begins. Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers scream over the coastline. They target Battleship Row. Heavy shells and torpedoes tear into the steel hulls. Water churns with oil and blood. The USS Arizona takes a direct hit. An armor-piercing bomb penetrates the deck and reaches the forward magazine. 1 million pounds of gunpowder ignite in a single heartbeat. A massive fireball climbs 500 feet into the air. 1,177 crew members die in minutes. Most never realize the ship is under attack. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma becomes a target. 9 torpedoes slam into its side. The hull rips open. The ship rolls over and capsizes. 429 men are trapped inside the dark, flooded hull. They bang on the metal walls, but the water rises too fast. 2 hours of chaos follow. The results are visible in the burning harbor. 8 battleships are sunk or heavily damaged. 188 American aircraft are turned into scrap metal on the runways. 2,403 Americans are dead. Japan's losses are minimal. 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 130 men. In Tokyo, the military celebrates, at first glance, a total victory, but in reality, a strategic failure. The Japanese High Command sought to destroy the American battleship fleet. They succeeded. The Pacific offensive can now proceed without interference, but there were critical errors in the planning. Where were the carriers? The 3 primary American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, were not in the harbor. The Enterprise was delayed by a storm at sea. The Lexington was delivering planes to Midway. The Saratoga was docked in San Diego. All 3 remained fully operational. Events would soon prove their value. But the Japanese missed more than just the ships. The camera records the hills surrounding the port. Massive steel cylinders line the landscape. These are the fuel storage tanks. They hold millions of gallons of oil. If these tanks were destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would have no choice but to retreat to the California coast. The Japanese bombers ignored them. They focused on the battleships and the airfields. The fuel remained untouched. It was a grave mistake. The war was only beginning. December 7th, 1941. The smoke over Pearl Harbor hid a massive Japanese failure. The repair docks remained untouched. These facilities would soon raise and rebuild the sunken battleships. The submarine base was also fully operational. From here, the Americans would launch the most devastating undersea campaign in history. Japan sank the hulls, but they left the infrastructure that would bring those ships back to life. The psychological impact was even greater. Before the attack, American public opinion was fractured. Isolationists and interventionists fought in the streets and in the press. After the first bomb fell, the nation unified instantly. There was no more debate. There was no more hesitation. December 8, 1941. President Roosevelt stood before Congress. He asked for a formal declaration of war. The Senate vote was 82-0. The House of Representatives voted 388-1. The lone dissenter was Jeannette Rankin of Montana. She was the first woman ever elected to Congress. In 1917, she had also voted against entering World War I. Rankin followed her conscience, but she stood alone. The footage shows thousands of young men lining up at recruitment offices. America stopped talking about peace. America prepared to fight. This shift changed the course of global history. But a critical misunderstanding existed in Tokyo. Japan's leaders failed to grasp the scale of the coming conflict. At first glance, a military triumph, but in reality, a strategic suicide. The quality of the Japanese military was not the issue. Their pilots were elite. They had more flight hours than almost any other air force. The Mitsubishi Zero fighter was a masterpiece of engineering. In 1941, it was superior to every American plane in the sky. But bravery and technology have limits. Modern wars are not won by tactics alone. They are won by factories. The question was simple. Could Japan outproduce the United States? The industrial gap was a chasm. Consider the raw numbers. These are the statistics that decided the war before a single shot was fired. In 1940, the United States produced 4 million motor vehicles. Japan produced 48,000. There was no turning back. The industrial engine of America was waking up. The story of the Pacific War became a story of assembly lines. The verdict was already written in steel. One word: steel. In modern warfare, steel is the foundation of every ship, every tank, and every shell. 1941. American mills produced 75 million tons of steel in a single year. Japan produced 7 million. The ratio was 13-1. It was a mathematical execution. In 1 month, American workers manufactured more steel than Japanese industry could produce in 12 months. Could Japan sustain a long war? It was impossible. The numbers were stacked against them from the first day. But raw materials were only half the problem. Then there was oil. The United States pumped over 1 billion barrels out of the ground annually. From the fields of Texas to the rigs in California and Oklahoma, the flow never stopped. Japan had almost zero domestic oil. They imported every drop. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, they seized the Dutch East Indies. They wanted the wells. But the plan failed. Allied forces didn't just leave, they sabotaged the infrastructure. They blew up the wells and burned the refineries before retreating. Japanese engineers spent months trying to repair the damage. Even when the oil finally flowed, there was no way to move it. Japan lacked the tankers. American submarines patrolled the shipping lanes, sinking everything in sight. The oil stayed in the ground or sank to the bottom of the ocean. Next, look at the human cost. The United States had 132 million citizens. Japan had 73 million. America possessed twice the population and twice the workforce. They had twice the number of potential soldiers. The American economy was 5 times larger than the Japanese Empire. It wasn't a fair fight. It was an industrial steamroller. How many planes can a nation build? The footage shows the answer. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories rolled out 354,000 aircraft. This included fighters, heavy bombers, and torpedo planes. During that same window, Japan built 76,000. The gap grew every day. By 1944, American production hit its peak. In that year alone, the United States built 96,000 aircraft. The sheer volume of engines and wings coming off the assembly lines was unprecedented. Japan could not match the pace. The war was decided on the factory floor. 100,000 aircraft. That is more than the Japanese Empire produced during the entire conflict. Japan reached its peak in 1944 with 28,000 planes. The United States surpassed that number 3 times over every single year. The gap in shipbuilding was even wider. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched 147 aircraft carriers. This included heavy fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Total count, 147. Japan launched 18. How did the balance of power look on the ground? It is 1943. Japanese engineers are working on 3 new carriers. At that exact moment, American shipbuilders have 22 Essex-class fleet carriers under construction simultaneously. The pace never slowed down. In the 3 years following the Battle of Midway, Japan finished 6 carriers. The United States finished 17. But warships were only one part of the machine. America also produced 2,700 Liberty ships. These were massive cargo vessels, troop transports, and supply ships. The math is simple. American industry delivered 3 new ships every 48 hours. This pace continued for 4 years straight. Japan could not match this output. There was no competition. At first glance, a naval war, but in reality, an industrial execution. This was a mismatch of historic proportions. Japan built their entire strategy on a single assumption. They believed Americans would see the rising cost of blood, lose their will, and quit the fight. Was this a mistake? It was not entirely irrational. Japan had used this exact strategy against the Russian Empire in 1904. They expected history to repeat itself. The footage shows massive steel hulls sliding into the water every week, the sound of thousands of rivets being driven into metal echoes through the shipyards. The factory lights in Detroit and Richmond never turned off. Japan looked at the maps. They should have looked at the factories. Events accelerated. The American industrial engine turned the Pacific into a one-sided logistical war. There was no turning back. The scale of production became a weapon itself. 140 million people, 5 million square kilometers of territory, massive reserves of oil and timber. On paper, the Russian Empire in 1905 was a titan, but the reality on the ground was different. Japan destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, sending dozens of warships to the bottom of the ocean. The war was draining the treasury. The Russian population was exhausted and rioting in the streets. Tsar Nicholas II saw no other choice. He accepted a peace settlement and retreated. Japan believed this same logic would apply to the United States. It was a catastrophic misreading of American political culture. Was 1941 America the same as 1905 Russia? Not even close. America was a democracy, but it was not a fragile one. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not break public morale. It unified the country. The footage from December 7th shows thick black smoke rising over the harbor and sailors jumping into burning water. Japan expected the Americans to lose heart. Instead, they lost their patience. The attack wasn't viewed as a military setback. It was viewed as a betrayal. In Washington, Japanese diplomats were still talking peace while their planes were dropping torpedoes in Hawaii. Americans did not want a seat at the negotiating table. They wanted revenge. Unlike the Tsar's Russia, America had the industrial base to take it. Factories began converting from cars to tanks within weeks. But there was another problem the Japanese leadership didn't foresee. Japan was not fighting in a vacuum. The war in the Pacific was only one piece of the puzzle. Thousands of miles away, Germany was fighting the Soviet Union. The stakes were absolute. If the Soviets collapsed, Germany would dominate the entire European continent. Japan would find itself isolated, facing the combined might of Britain and the United States alone. Events accelerated. Japan needed Germany to win, or at least keep the British and Soviets occupied. But Hitler made a gamble of his own. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. Suddenly, America was mobilized for a global conflict on 2 fronts. It was fighting Japan, Germany, and Italy simultaneously. How could one nation fight across two oceans at once? It seemed impossible. But American strategists made a cold calculation. The plan was Germany first. They decided to crush the most dangerous enemy in Europe before turning their full attention to the Pacific. This meant Japan was facing only a fraction of American military and industrial power. Despite this, the Japanese Navy was still losing. The trap had closed. There was no way out. June 4th, 1942. 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire dominated the Pacific. The Philippines had fallen, Malaya had fallen. Singapore and the Dutch East Indies were under Japanese control. Japan held a vast ocean empire, but one problem remained. The United States Navy still had its aircraft carriers. Admiral Yamamoto needed a final blow. The target was Midway Island. It sat 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto wanted to seize the island and force the American carriers into a trap. He led a massive fleet of 4 aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers. It was the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled in one place. The Americans were outnumbered. They had only 3 carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. 1 month earlier, the Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Military analysts thought she was out of the fight, but Navy repair crews worked 72 hours straight. They patched the hull and cleared the smoke. The Yorktown sailed. Intelligence was the decisive weapon. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese radio traffic. They cracked the code. They knew the date, the time, and the location. On June 4th, the trap was reversed. American dive bombers descended from the clouds. They caught 3 Japanese carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu, at their most vulnerable moment. The decks were crowded with fueled aircraft and live bombs. The footage shows the results. 5 minutes, that is all it took. 3 carriers became burning wrecks. Later that day, the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, was sent to the bottom. The losses were absolute. In 24 hours, Japan lost the core of its naval power. 4 fleet carriers were gone. More than 250 aircraft were destroyed. 3,000 men died. Among them were 200 of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy. The Americans lost only the Yorktown and a single destroyer. Japan never recovered. At first glance, it was a loss of metal and wood. But in reality, it was a loss of human capital. These weren't just ships. They were the veteran heart of Japanese aviation. The mechanics knew every engine bolt by heart. The pilots had years of combat experience. A shipyard can launch a new carrier in 12 months. It takes years to train a carrier pilot. Events accelerated toward a collapse. The production gap became a death sentence for the empire. It led directly to the next disaster, the pilot training crisis. 700 hours. That was the average flight time for a Japanese naval pilot in 1941. At the start of the conflict, American pilots entered the cockpit with only 150 hours. On paper, the advantage was absolute. Japan possessed superior aviators, more maneuverable aircraft, and refined combat tactics. But by the middle of 1944, the situation inverted completely. Why did the elite Japanese air arm collapse? At first glance, it was a matter of planes, but in reality, it was a matter of time. New Japanese pilots began graduating from accelerated programs with only 40 hours of total flight time. 40 hours. This was barely enough training to take off and land on a moving carrier deck without crashing. Meanwhile, the American training machine had reached its peak. By mid-1944, every new American pilot arrived in the Pacific with at least 525 hours of flight experience. The math was brutal. Japan could not replace its veterans. The United States was training new pilots faster than the enemy could kill them. June 1944. The Philippine Sea. The American counteroffensive moved across the Pacific like a tidal wave. United States forces closed in on the Mariana Islands. The targets, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Japan launched a massive carrier strike to stop them. 9 carriers, over 400 aircraft. The footage from the cockpits shows the result. American pilots flew the new F-6F Hellcat. These machines were fast, armored, and deadly. They tore through the Japanese formations. In the frame, Japanese planes catch fire and disintegrate mid-air. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost over 600 aircraft in just 2 days. For comparison, that is more planes than the Japanese industry produced in an entire year during its peak production cycle. American losses totaled 123 aircraft. It was a massacre. Events accelerated. By this stage, the United States Navy operated 18 fleet and light carriers in the Pacific. Japan had 9, but the numbers were only the surface. American carriers were equipped with advanced radar systems. American pilots had hundreds of hours of tactical training. American factories replaced lost aircraft within days. The camera records the deck of a Japanese carrier, inexperienced pilots, obsolete engines, and empty hangars. There was no way to replace the dead. The disparity became total. In the final 8 months of the war, the United States Navy lost only 2 dive bombers and 5 torpedo planes in actual aerial combat. The Imperial Japanese Navy still existed on paper, but as a fighting force, it was finished. The sea belonged to the Americans. December 7th, 1941. That date sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. The Japanese strategy relied on one single hope: the United States would simply give up. But history proves otherwise. The United States does not abandon wars it is committed to, particularly after a surprise attack kills thousands of citizens on home soil. Why did Tokyo believe they could win? They underestimated American industrial resolve. Even if every Japanese tactical maneuver had been flawless, the outcome remained the same. Even if the Battle of Midway resulted in a total American defeat, it would not have changed the final trajectory. Even with better trained pilots and superior naval coordination, the math did not add up. Wars of attrition are not won by bravery. They are won by the side that replaces lost equipment and men the fastest. Japan was physically unable to do this. Consider a different scenario. Japan wins at Midway. All 3 American carriers sink to the bottom of the Pacific. Thousands more American sailors drown. What happens the next day? American shipyards simply lay down more hulls. Training schools graduate thousands of fresh pilots. The counteroffensive continues. It is relentless, it is inevitable. The industrial base in the United States was out of reach and untouchable. The numbers tell the story. By 1943, the Japanese economy was already redlining. It was running at maximum capacity. Factories operated 24 hours a day. Civilian production had been gutted. Every scrap of metal and every drop of oil went to the front lines. It still was not enough. At first glance, Japan was a powerhouse. But in reality, it was an ant fighting a giant. The United States was fighting on 2 oceans simultaneously in 1943 and 1944. It shipped massive amounts of food, steel, and fuel to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. It equipped millions of its own soldiers. It built thousands of ships and tens of thousands of aircraft. Despite this massive strain, American production continued to climb. The footage from the era shows lines of Liberty ships launching every few days. The camera records endless rows of bombers rolling off assembly lines in the Midwest. By 1945, the world shifted. More than 50% of all industrial production on the entire planet was happening inside the United States. No nation could compete with that output. There was no mistake. Admiral Yamamoto understood the data. This is why his warning to the Japanese government was so precise. He told his superiors he could run wild for 6 months or a year. After that window closed, he had no expectation of success. He knew the clock was ticking. Events accelerated just as he predicted. Thus ended the hope of a Japanese victory. June 1942. 6 months had passed since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto was right. Historical records confirm that while his staff celebrated the victory in Hawaii, Yamamoto sat alone. He was in a state of visible depression. He understood the math. He knew he had just signed Japan's death warrant, but the Empire of Japan attacked anyway. Why did they do it? Withdrawing from China was not an option. Accepting the American oil embargo was out of the question. The military government could not lose face. To the leadership in Tokyo, retreat was politically impossible. The footage from the era shows the scale of the gamble. Japan bet on American war weariness. They hoped for a negotiated peace. It was a fatal mistake. The reason for their failure was simple. It was not because American soldiers were braver. It was not because American generals were smarter. It was because of the factories. American assembly lines could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The sound of industrial presses was the sound of the war ending. At first glance, a naval conflict, but in reality, a war of logistics. Wars of attrition are won by the side with the better replacement rate. In 1941, that side was the United States. The gap was massive. There was no contest. Japan's leadership had the data. Yamamoto gave them a direct warning. The oil embargo meant the Imperial Navy had 18 months of fuel left. After that, the fleet would stop moving. They chose to strike regardless. Events accelerated toward disaster. Was Pearl Harbor a rational calculation? Was it a desperate gamble? Or was it strategic suicide? One thing is certain, the industrial reality was ignored. The camera records the result, thousands of planes and ships produced by a single economy. Japan tried to win an economic war against an adversary that could build 10 tanks for every one Japan produced. This is what happens when ideology overrides math. This is what happens when leaders choose war while knowing they will likely lose. It was never a close fight. The story of the Pacific was decided on the factory floor. Thus ended the era of Japanese expansion.